Okay, so this isn't quite, we've got another case study coming up on Thursday from Henry Moss. I mean, this is kind of what you've all been waiting for, because you all did a course on machine learning. So you wanted to know about deep neural networks and all that sort of stuff. And we haven't done anything on that at all. But fortunately, Sam has. But in this case, as you'll see, very cool example where you're using the deep neural network training is effectively the simulation for everything you've heard so far. So instead of looking at, well, is it a physical system? Instead of looking at a physical system, you're looking at, the training of a neural network. Sam's just got the coolest background. He's a PhD student with me. He did his MPhil here, so he sat where you are. But before he came to me, the cool background isn't with me. Before he came to me, he sort of undergrad in computer science, master's here, but then moved into psychology. The sort of basic premise of a lot of his work is taking techniques from the psychological literature and applying them to machine learning, which has opened up a range of really interesting directions, one of which he's going to tell you about now. So, reevaluating scientific claims with a multiverse analysis. Over to you, Sam.
Thanks, Neil. Just to check, can everyone hear me at the back? Okay, let's talk like this. Okay, awesome. And maybe just a bit of context before we start. Probably what I'm going to do is tell you why deep learning doesn't really work, actually, just in case Neil sets your expectations, in the wrong direction, right? So really, I guess my background, the stuff that I'm really interested in is ensuring that machine learning does work. And that means typically understanding whether the claims that we make are actually true. And I guess what I'm going to talk about today is a way in which we can evaluate the status of the claims that we typically make in machine learning. And we'll apply some of the stuff that I think that you've covered in this course so far, things like Gaussian process surrogates and Bayesian experimental design to doing that. So just to give you a bit of an outline of the kind of things that we'll talk about kind of an efficient machine learning scientific loop. So what does it mean to actually be good as scientists and have a productive scientific community in machine learning? And then we'll talk about this idea of the multiverse analysis. That probably won't mean anything right now, but it will a little bit later. And we'll talk about challenges in applying machine learning, the multiverse analysis, to a machine learning setting. That'll motivate some of the kind of techniques that I was describing, like a Gaussian process surrogate. And then we'll apply those to kind of a couple of different case studies that are directly about deep learning and about contentious claims that people have made in deep learning theory and in sort of the practice of deep learning over the last couple of years. So you could think of those as sort of case studies within this broader case study. And then we'll leave some time at the end for kind of future stuff. I'll raise some kind of critiques of the approach that we've taken here, and I probably won't give you any answers. So I guess to get started, I'm going to show you a couple of different papers, and we're going to just talk through some of the claims that they make. And these are papers that are about the reproducibility of machine learning as a whole. So just to read you this, a little snippet from the abstract of this first paper. Despite a very rich research activity leading to numerous interesting GAN algorithms, what we might find is that most models can reach similar scores with enough hyperparameter optimization and random restarts. So the reason I bring this up is because we spend a lot of effort, I guess, as a broad community, maybe particularly in the GAN community, coming up with new stuff that's meant to be useful, that's meant to be good. It's an innovative, trendy new architecture. But I guess the core claim of most of that work, this is saying it's false, right? The cause of the innovation, the cause of the performance improvement isn't the new innovation, it's hyperparameter optimization. So we could take a look at another example where we think about neural language modeling. And we can see that we have things like ongoing innovations, state-of-the-art results against these language modeling benchmarks. But if we were to look a little closer, we might find that kind of standard architectures with some sensible regularization outperform recent models. We could look at another example. This is about recommendation approaches, neural recommendation approaches. And this quote, I think, to any of you who've done anything in deep learning or read much stuff about deep learning, it's difficult to keep track of what represents the state of the art at the moment. That should be familiar. But recently proposed models don't outperform conceptually or computationally simpler, sometimes long-known algorithms. So again, to think about the claims of us as a community, we're saying we're developing new innovative stuff. but are we? And one more final example. We've proposed copious modifications to the transformer architecture. And we find that most modifications don't meaningfully improve performance, and performance improvements may strongly depend on implementation details. So like, these are just 4 examples. I really could go on, and I don't want to bore you with like plethora of examples of how what we say is true in machine learning isn't really true. But I wanted to bring these up because they're all about replication failures, every single one of these examples. And the replication failures because the central claim that an architecture or a modification or something that we've invented is the root cause of improved performance turns out to be false. And this is really important, right? Because you could think about each of these failures as being wasted time, wasted effort, wasted resources. And these things actually get really important when you think about us as researchers. I'm a PhD student. If I'm developing my program of research and I build it on top of flawed foundations, that's not a very fun experience. But also you think about it as from the perspective of a community, from society. You know, we're wasting public funding doing all of this machine learning research that doesn't really do anything useful. And more recently, we've started to question the climate impact of deep learning research. And what I want to just be clear about here is I'm not calling all deep learning research pointless. Of course, we know that's not the case, but obviously just like in any research program, some of it is. And I think the idea that we would want conclusions that are robust, conclusions that are reproducible, is important. And if we don't have that, then yeah, we're wasting our time. So just to motivate this a little bit further, I hope that you all agree with me, we want our research to count. And that means that we need conclusions that are reproducible. And really what we mean by that is we want other researchers, they can test the same claim and they can get the same result. There's many other kind of definitions of reproducibility floating around, people thinking about like open science practices, but really this is the most important one, right? You can take a claim, you know, something, you know, some new invention performs better than some other older invention, and you can get the same result if you test that claim again. But what actually happens is we find that the conclusions that we have, we want them to generalize, and we want them to hold in spite of kind of irrelevant details. And what I guess we're showing you in that case, with all of those 4 papers I showed you before, is that those irrelevant details matter, right? It's things like actually spending a little bit more on hyperparameter optimization or proper regularization. Those are the details that really matter in drawing robust conclusions. And I think that's really the core of what I'm trying to talk about today. If we can just say like model X is the best, that's like not very useful if it's only true under really narrow conditions. Whether that's like a choice of benchmark or data set, whether that's a choice of hyperparameters or a choice of architecture. So what I'm really advocating today is we want conclusions that are general and useful. And I hope you agree with me. So if we want this kind of, we have this quest for reproducible results and sort of meaningful machine learning research, I'm going to talk about why we can use the multiverse analysis as a tool to do that. But let's start with an example, first of all, from social psychology. And just before I jump into this example, I want to highlight that the claim is probably pretty outrageous, and I'm not backing the claim. I'm just raising it here as a kind of point, and I want you to be critical about it. So there's a paper in 2013 called The Fluctuating Female Vote. And in this paper, the central claim is that fertility influences women's religious and political preferences. So already, I think your eyebrows should be raising, right? Like this is an unusual claim, and we'll talk about the methods that go into this. But and what happens is that in this paper, Cristina Durante and her co-authors, they survey 502 women, and they ask them to self-report things like their religious beliefs, their social and physical political attitudes, their relationship status, and they ask them some questions about their most recent menstrual cycle. And you get this after doing, you know, it's if you read the paper, which maybe I would recommend that you do, although I can't strongly recommend that you do, given what we'll say about it subsequently. If you read the paper, you'll see that they do some pretty decent analysis. They come up with some results, and the results look something like this. So this is the effect of ovulation, fertility, on religiosity. So a high number on the y-axis is high religious belief, and a low number on the y-axis is low religious belief. So, and you can see it's broken out by single versus in a relationship. And so what we see there is, and what should immediately jump out at you is, depending on single or in a relationship, the effect is reversed. So among single women, high fertility leads to low religiosity, whereas in a committed relationship women, it's the other way around. So that's weird. And we could look at a second example. So, and just to be clear, I'm cherry picking these results just to make a point, but we could look at a second example where we're talking about the exact same phenomenon, but with social political attitudes. So here on the y-axis, that score, a high number on the score represents sort of more conservative beliefs, and a low number on that score represents more liberal beliefs. You see exactly the same relationship. So the central claim here that's made by Durante and her co-authors is that there's a fertility and relationship status interaction effect on religiosity and on political attitudes, both social and fiscal, although I've excluded fiscal from this. Also on some other stuff, actually, like voter preference. It's 2013, I think they're doing Obama versus someone else, and they're also doing donation preferences. So there's a lot of stuff here, and they find this effect reasonably consistently. But I guess the question we should ask is, do we believe it? And I hope that you don't. So what's the problem here? So I mean, again, if you read that code, like it seems decent. Like it seems like they're trying hard. 502 is a pretty big sample size. Those methods are reasonable. But the challenge is that Durante and her co-authors, they make a lot of choices about how to do their stuff, right? And if we go back and we look at those choices, as Sarah Stegan and co-authors do in their paper, Introducing Transparency Through a Multiverse Analysis, which is the basis for this work that I'm talking about today, you see things like which cycle days are considered high fertility, right? That's a question. We have to make a choice there. And we could pick day 7 to 14 or 6 to 14 or whatever. And these seem like kind of arbitrary decisions, but they're all based on things that Durante and co-authors have done in previous papers. So they're all reasonable, like justifiable decisions. It's not to say that they're wrong, it's just that they were a choice. Other choices might include like how you estimate menstrual onset. Do you do self-reported or do you do some estimation procedure? You might also ask questions like what counts as in a relationship? And I think this is like the most obvious one. Like, does dating mean single? And what's the level of commitment that determines that? Like, you have to, the question of dichotomizing these things into two different buckets, there are different ways to do that. And as a really simple example, you might also think about outlier exclusion criteria. So there are many ways in which you might want to choose to exclude people because they might, not fit into the kind of regular sample. And the way that you do that will matter. So in Sarah Stegan's analysis, what they do is they go through all of the different choices that Durante makes, and they count up all the different possible combinations, and they realize there were 210 different ways you could have done this study. And that's really important, right? Because if you think about Durante doing this study, they pick one definition of cycle days to be considered high fertility and one definition of relationship status. But they could have just as easily chosen a different set of decisions. And if they do that, what would happen? And that's the essence of the multiverse analysis. If you think about you in your universe doing your experiment, and then you think about someone else in a subsequent universe and someone else in a different universe, and they're all doing slightly different versions of the experiment, what would the conclusion look like? And actually what Sarah Stegan et al. Do is that they do exactly this. They rerun the analysis over and over and over again under all of those different decisions. So on the screen behind me here, you can see the results of the fertility by relationship status interaction effect on religiosity. And a gray cell is a low p-value, like a significant result, and the white cell is a null finding. And what should really jump out at you straight away is the whole thing isn't gray. That's what we want, right? If this conclusion is really true, you should be able to vary all of these arbitrary choices, and you should get the same conclusion. But it turns out it's not true. You see loads of white cells, and in particular, the R1, R2, R3 columns are different ways of coding up relationship status. So the effect here is totally dependent on how you determine what single means, which should be kind of intuitive, right? That makes sense. We can see exactly the same thing with social and political attitudes, and it's almost the same phenomenon, right? The way that you describe relationship status really matters. And the reason I'm talking about this is because the whole idea here is that this is a conclusion which hopefully I prompted you all to be skeptical, but this is a conclusion that isn't robust to arbitrary choices. And that's the real problem here. So I just said that. They're specific, the idea is these claims, they're specific to arbitrary implementation details. And if you made a different set of choices, the conclusion could just as easily be false. And I think that's particularly important to think about in the context of, the claim we made about fertility and this effect on like really important things, right? Like social and political attitudes and religiosity. Like extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. And I think like if it could just as easily be false, that's not really good enough. So this is the whole point of talking about this, is that this is to motivate this idea of the multiverse analysis. It's to redo the analysis, it's to redo the experiment at every different point in the space of possible choices, and to systematically review the conclusions. If we have conclusions that are robust and that are general, they'll hold throughout the multiverse. You'll get a big gray grid. Whereas if otherwise you'll see this kind of thing where the conclusions vary with the arbitrary choices. But I mean, we're meant to be talking about machine learning. I have promised I'll talk about deep learning. So I guess that's the most important thing. Why are we talking about this? And I think it should hopefully be clear that just like Durante and her co-authors, we make decisions in machine learning all the time. And you could think about this case of, invention X, it improves model performance. In order to do that, we need a model architecture to modify, we need baselines to compare against, we need data sets, evaluation metrics. That's even before you get to things like hyperparameters, where you have this huge space of hyperparameters you can choose from, or hyperparameter optimization methods. And actually a really interesting one here is to think about the different choice of implementation libraries. There's a bunch of evidence to show that as you switch from something like TensorFlow to PyTorch, all the results built on TensorFlow fall to pieces. So there's something interesting here, right? Like we're making all of these decisions, and really we want our results to hold no matter what. And it should be obvious that this is just one huge multiverse. And the whole thing that we're trying to do here is apply the multiverse analysis to machine learning conclusions. So that's kind of interesting because it raises a few key questions, and hopefully this should kind of tie back into what you've been studying so far. The biggest challenge we have is we have lots of choices. So, I presented this kind of small set that Sarah Stegan came up with of, I think, 5 different ways you could have resliced the analysis, and you get 210 combinations out of it. But I think in machine learning, I think we just fundamentally have a much bigger search space to work with. And that's, as I said, it's really obvious when you think about hyperparameters, but it's also really obvious when you think about the number of us making like research outputs and like making our own decisions all the time. That space of decisions is massive. And the second challenge is that a lot of those dimensions that we can include in the search space are continuous. Like you can think about most hyperparameters. So it's not possible to just exhaustively enumerate them, or at least it's very, very expensive to exhaustively enumerate them and to systematically test the effect of every single decision. So hopefully you can see where I'm going with this, which is that we could model the multiverse for efficient exploration. And that's the purpose of what we're going to talk about today. So I apologize for that 20-minute intro, actually. So how do we talk about efficient multiverse exploration? So just to get some definitions out of the way, we're going to start with an evaluation function. So the point here is this is our kind of conclusion of interest, right? It is a map from a set of researcher decisions to a conclusion. That conclusion could be like a p-value that represents a significant statistical hypothesis test, but it could just be like something like test accuracy if that's the type of claim that you want to make. So this is your kind of formalization of your conclusion. And then we have a search space. And this represents all the different possible kind of choices you could make and the different ways in which you could like redo your analysis or redo your experiment. And then we'll talk about this in more detail in a few moments, but just to step through it at a really high level, what we're going to do is we're going to sample a set of points, x0, from the search space. So that's going to be our initial design. I hope some of this should be familiar to you. We're going to sample an initial design x0. We're going to evaluate our evaluation function L at every point, so we get a set of conclusions. So now we have a set x0, which is a set of sets of decisions, and we have a set y0, which is the corresponding conclusions. So again, thinking about this, like maybe it'll be true everywhere, or maybe it'll be high accuracy everywhere, or maybe it'll vary a lot depending on the impact of those decisions. As you might have imagined, we're going to fit a GP model F to x0, y0. So the point there is that we let this model model the relationship between researcher decisions and conclusions. And then we're going to use an acquisition function A on F to sample and evaluate a new batch. And that's going to tell us what other sets of decisions, what other choices do we want to test next. And then we're just going to repeat that process until some stopping criterion. What I've specified here is like until we have a high confidence picture of the multiverse, but it could be until you run out of money, for example, which is exactly what happened to me. So, and so this should be pretty obvious that this is basic experimental design applied to the space of researcher decisions and conclusions. So, just to talk through that in a little bit of detail, I'm probably going to skip over most of the kind of the real detail, and we'll talk more about the high level. But in terms of what we actually do, we're going to use a snowball sequence as a low discrepancy sequence for our initial design. And we choose that because it attains good coverage over the whole search space. That's number one. For our GP, actually, we're going to keep it really simple. I mean, as I said before, we're going to model conclusions as a noisy function of researcher decisions. There's not that much to say about this. We can talk about the details of how we do the GP model if that's interesting, and we'll raise some kind of critical thoughts at the end about whether modeling a model is sensible or something. And then to talk about our acquisition function, because this is, I guess, the important point, we're going to use integrated posterior variance reduction. So the point here is to choose the point which lowers the overall variance the most. So when we're deciding which set of decisions we want to test next, what we really want to do is learn the most we can. And we'll motivate that a little bit in a moment, because I think that's reasonably atypical, I think, in a machine learning setting. But just to talk about that in detail, what that means is the way that we value a candidate point xi plus 1 in this example, in this equation, we're going to compare the difference in variance across the whole space. That's why we're integrating over the whole search space between the overall variance had we sampled that point versus the overall variance had we not sampled that point. So we want the point that lowers the overall variance the most. Now, of course, integrating over the whole space is challenging, so we do that with Monte Carlo approximation. So those are some implementation details. And we can talk about those in more detail if you're interested, or I'll refer you to our paper at the end. But something that's really important to talk about is this idea of exploration versus optimization. So probably what is very typical in a machine learning setting is for us to optimize, right? Like we do hyperparameter optimization. We're kind of familiar with this idea of searching through spaces to find good performing configurations. And I suppose, like, first of all, in the scientific setting, that's like, that could even be like malpractice, right? If you're looking for a conclusion and you search for the points where the conclusion is true, that's maybe not good science. But I think also, just to give you a more concrete example, you know, something we might do in hyperparameter optimization is we might use something like upper confidence band, right? Where the next point is either expected high reward or high information gain. So this would be kind of like a typical thing that you might do in hyperparameter optimization. And to look at a concrete example, imagine we're optimizing SVM hyperparameters, and we have two hyperparameters, C and gamma, and we're looking at the effect on test accuracy. If we use UCB, we might see something that looks like this figure here. So this is a contour plot of test accuracy with hyperparameter C on the bottom and gamma on the y-axis. And what you might conclude, as I'm sure is a totally reasonable conclusion, that there's one region of high performance. It's that big yellow bit in the bottom right corner where you have high C and low gamma. So if we're optimizing, that's the conclusion that we would draw. Alternatively, if you use IVR and you search the whole space, actually you realize that that region isn't a region at all. It's not high C, high gamma. It's a plateau. And you can vary C as much as you want, as long as you vary gamma appropriately. So that's interesting. If you're really interested in how SVM hyperparameters work, that could be interesting to you. You've learned a lot more by doing that than you have through optimization. But it becomes even more interesting when you think about secondary objectives. Like, it's very rare that we would be deploying a machine learning system in a case where all we care about is test accuracy. And like a really simple example of this is you think about fairness. So maybe we want to ensure parity or equal performance across different subgroups within the data set. So in this synthetic example here, I'm going to show you how along that IVR plateau of high test accuracy, the one that you only know about if you do exploration rather than optimization, along that plateau, you see that the difference in group accuracy can vary. You wouldn't know that you had this extra degree of freedom to play with C as long as you vary gamma, unless you explore the space thoroughly. So hopefully that's just a kind of a simple motivation to say, you know, there's a time for optimization, like, of course, like sometimes we want good performance, but there's also a time for exploration. And depending on the point that you are at the kind of the progress from like, you know, science to application, maybe you want both, but certainly we maybe don't want premature optimization. Okay, so just to put everything that we've talked about together, we want to understand the generality and robustness of scientific conclusions in machine learning. Hopefully, like that's important. Hopefully you agree that that's important. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to explore the effect of researcher choices. We're going to do that by modeling, because we know that it's, you know, intractable. It's like far too expensive to search through the whole space. So we're going to use a GP surrogate to do that. And we're going to select the most informative points to evaluate using integrated variance reduction. So let's do this with a case study inside our case study. So we're going to think about adaptive optimization. So I think most of you will know about stochastic gradient descent. And let's just think about two common optimizers for training deep neural networks. On the one hand, we have SGD with momentum, where the idea is that we update our parameters by taking a step in the direction of steepest descent, normalized by this momentum term, which we'll gloss over. It's not very important for the purpose of today. Another optimizer might be ADAM. This is a super popular adaptive optimizer, where instead of normalizing by this momentum term, we're kind of normalizing by the mean and variance of the gradient. So you kind of want to penalize noisy estimates of the gradient. They're both super popular. They both work really well. But there's kind of some emerging evidence that says maybe you don't need to use one. You could also use the other. That's like a kind of typical claim. Or maybe there's no point in using ADAM, or maybe there's no point in using SGD. So, you know, you can imagine, I've given you two examples here with references 2 and 3, but there's a bunch, and we could keep going about that. So there's lots of back and forth about which one is best. So a natural way for us to think about this is to try and abstract over the differences and to think about whether adaptive optimizers are helpful, and to apply a multiverse analysis to answering that question. I just realized I need to highlight something. So one thing to think about here actually is in this definition of ADAM, you can see that this MT term, you know, I really won't go into the details, is the mean, and the VT term is the variance. But there's this little extra parameter epsilon. And just pay attention to that, because it's tied to ADAM for numerical stability. It's meant to be irrelevant. But some researchers suggested it's really important, and other researchers suggested it really is just there for numerical stability. So you can see that there's a kind of sense of like, you know, we disagree with each other as a community. That's good. That's like part of the scientific process, but maybe there's a way we can cut through that. So are adaptive optimizers helpful? So we're going to set this up as a multiverse with an evaluation function that is comparative. So that means we're going to compare the accuracy of a model trained with SGD versus a model trained with ADAM. So what we'll get as the result of our evaluation function is like a delta, a performance delta. We'll get a positive number or a negative number, depending on which one is better. And then we're going to use a search base, which is over learning rate, because our intuition should tell us that that's important for your choice of optimizer, but also over this epsilon parameter, because we've kind of been told conflicting claims about whether it's important or whether it's not important. So what we're going to do is at every different point that we sample, we're going to train two different models. We're going to train one model, it'll be the same architecture, but we'll train two different models, one with SGD and one with ADAM, and we'll take the difference. To get specific, the model is going to be VGG16, trained on CFAR 100, I think. Yeah, CFAR 100. So it's nothing complicated. And the reason we chose those models is because that's what the previous work that's been built around this claim of should you or shouldn't you use Adam has used. So we're thinking about this as a kind of replication where we take the essential details of previous work and then we vary learning rate and epsilon to understand their effect. So what's going to happen? If you look at this figure on the left, this is the estimate of our evaluation function by learning rate and epsilon. So in these red areas, you're looking at points where SGD outperforms Adam. And in the blue areas, you're looking at points where Adam outperforms SGD. So immediately what should jump out at you is the learning rate matters. And there are, I guess, like a really obvious thing to say is that there are blue regions and there are red regions. So that means there are points where you should use Adam and there are points where you should use SGD. So any conclusion that says it's conclusive, like use one or use the other, we're kind of showing that that's sensitive to these individual choices. On the right, we don't need to talk about that much, but just to say, one of the nice things about our GP surrogate, and I'm sure you're all familiar with, is we get an estimate of how well we've explored the search space. And in this case, the answer is pretty well. So, okay, so that's number one. Think about the effective learning rate there. The other thing is that you should see that most of the variance there is along the x-axis. It's not along the y-axis. There's almost no effect of epsilon. And we're going to confirm that with a sensitivity analysis. And that'll look something like this, where if you look at both the main and the total effects of the two parameters, epsilon and learning rate, where learning rate is in orange, you'll see that basically learning rate totally determines the relative choice of optimizer. So if you want to make a conclusion about is Adam best or is SGD best, it's learning rate that determines that, and it's not epsilon. So just to summarize the conclusions here, what we're saying is there isn't really a conclusive best optimizer. We're saying that the conclusion as to the best varies by learning rate and it doesn't vary by epsilon. So it's a little hard to go into all the details of the back and forth and the kind of like which optimizer is best literature, but certainly that helps to like cut through. So we can think about a second case study, this idea of the large batch generalization gap. I'm not sure how familiar you will be with this idea, but I guess it starts from the idea that when we train neural networks, we use mini batch SGD, right? So we don't take an estimate of the gradient over the whole data set, we do it batch by batch. And obviously that creates a question, like how large should the batch be? And there's a lot of kind of like engineering heuristics and like rules of thumb that we should use to choose a batch size. And there are kind of some strong motivations for using as large a batch size as you can, because it can be more efficient in terms of the number of gradient updates that you apply. And I think that's particularly the case in parallel training when you want to train one model over multiple nodes. And that's what motivates this kind of conversation about generalization. So how large should the batch be? I guess the challenge is, if we want to make a batch size really large, there's some evidence that there's a generalization gap. As we get to really large batch sizes, test performance drops. And we've seen some evidence that that's the case, as in this first reference here, and we've seen some evidence that that isn't the case. And actually, these are just two examples. There's a million papers on this, and every single one of them uses a different data set or a different model or makes a few different assumptions. So the interesting thing that we're trying to do here is not just do a replication of a single previous paper, but what we're actually trying to do is synthesize all of these conflicting claims and understand what's going on. So the question is there a large batch generalization gap? And the way that we'll do that is simply this time we're going to have an evaluation function that's just test accuracy, because that's what the claim is about. That's the generalization gap. And the search space is going to be learning rate and batch size. And that's because our intuition should tell us that batch size, obviously the question is framed in terms of batch size. We know batch size is important, but also our intuition should tell us that learning rate is important. But we also include these other parameters, data set and model. And that's because we're interested in whether our conclusions hold in spite of data set and model. They're there because they're irrelevant rather than relevant. And the interesting thing about the multiverse analysis is it helps us to kind of codify the different assumptions that we're making, right? In this case, we're saying, okay, we think learning rate is important, but we think data set isn't important. And that's one of the really useful things about doing this kind of analysis. There's another thing to say about these parameters, data set and model, and that's that they're categorical, which I guess can present a few challenges when we're setting up a GP model of the space. So the way that we're going to do this is with multi-fidelity modeling, which I think you should be reasonably familiar with. Yeah, okay, some nodding, okay. So how are we going to model these categorical parameters? The way that we're going to do that is we're going to treat every data set and every model as a different output function. So you could think about them as different fidelities. And one way of doing this is with an intrinsic co-regionalization model, where we basically scale up our kernel by this matrix B, such that we have independent but like interrelated outputs. And what we're going to do is think of those as each data set and model pair as a separate function, a separate output function. So I think maybe in terms of like multi-fidelity modeling, you're normally thinking about there's kind of an obvious difference in like fidelity, like a sort of sense of granularity, like something that's cheap to execute and something that's expensive to execute or something like that. Whereas in this case, there's no ranking like that. We're just saying each data set and each model, there are different fidelities. And the way that we do that specifically is we do this kind of two-step intrinsic co-regionalization model. So you can see that in the bottom half of the page, we're actually going to do this co-regionalization step twice. We're going to use this matrix BD that's going to control how the different data sets relate to each other. And this second parameter PM, which is going to control how related the different models are to each other. So there's more detail in the paper that I'll refer you to at the end, but actually probably the best reference to read about this is in number 2 here to read in more detail about intrinsic co-regionalization. So we're going to use multi-fidelity modeling to handle those categorical parameters, model and data set. So what does it look like? So thinking about this large batch generalization gap, probably the best figure to look at to begin with is in the top right. So this is the result of VGG on CFAR10. So, and again, each figure here is a different function in the multi-fidelity sense. It's a different output, but we're actually not that interested in that, right? We're just using it as a way to model the categorical parameters. And what we're interested in here is whether the conclusions hold across model and data set. So if you look at that VGG CFAR10 plot in the top right, you should see that the area of highest test accuracy moves from bottom left to top right. That means it moves from low batch size, low learning rate, to high batch size, high learning rate. And that is broadly, maybe you have to like close your eyes a little bit, but that's broadly consistent across each one of those plots. The area of highest test accuracy moves in a diagonal stripe from top right to bottom left. And what that tells us is that, okay, maybe you don't have to decrease test accuracy by increasing batch size as long as you increase learning rate. There's a couple of other things to talk about here. The first is that you should obviously notice a significant drop in test accuracy from CFAR10, the top row, to CFAR100, the bottom row. That's like, I guess, quite important, but the point is that the claim still holds even though that is the case, right? So we see this drop, which we should expect, like CFAR100 is a more complicated task than CFAR10, but the relationship is still broadly there. If any of you are confused about like the extra detail on these plots, there's a kind of white translucency that's areas of high training error. So some of those areas, it's actually quite hard to actually even get a model. You'd exclude that model even at the offset. And the black crosses are where we've totally had failed training. So maybe we've had like a vanishing gradient or something like that. And actually, one of the things I'm trying to do here is motivate like full transparency and including all the failed runs and including all the like successful runs. But that's kind of a side note from what we're talking about today. So broadly, the conclusion that we should be taking away from this figure is that there's this plateau of reasonably consistent test accuracy as you increase batch size, as long as you increase learning rate. And again, we can apply sensitivity analysis to this. So what's going on here, if you look at first of all, just focusing in on the main effect, so that's the effect of every parameter individually. You'll see that most of it's dominated by a data set. That's actually, I kind of want you to ignore that because what we've actually done is excluded some of the control plots where we trained on some other data sets where we just, couldn't get good performance at all. So there's no point even looking for a generalization gap because we couldn't train on those data sets. So that's why data set kind of dominates the effect here. But putting that to one side, you'll see that there's maybe a very marginal main effect of batch size, learning rate, and model, right? But if you compare that with the total effect, so that's the effect of every parameter in combination, like their interaction between each other, you see that suddenly batch size and learning rate jump up. And we interpret that as evidence that between batch size and learning rate, there's an interaction effect on test accuracy. So just to like draw a couple of conclusions here, what we're saying here is that, is there a large batch generalization gap? Does test performance necessarily drop as you increase batch size? We're saying that we don't, first of all, we're saying that we find results that are consistent across model and data set where training was successful. It's an annoying caveat. We're finding that there's an interaction between batch size and learning rate on the test accuracy. And we're saying that we don't think, according to our analysis, that there's a generalization gap if you properly scale learning rate at this time. So this is kind of important because what we've done here is we've brought together, I gave you 2 examples, but really there are millions of examples of different claims about generalization error and batch size. And we've managed to bring a few of them together and to bridge over the different choices of data set and model and draw a kind of general conclusion that holds across the board. So I think that's the end of our sort of case study of case studies. And we'll talk about some kind of fluffier stuff, I guess. So I wanted to raise a couple of kind of critiques of like what, maybe they're sort of like FAQs, like what do people say about this kind of approach? And I'm going to raise these as questions, and I'm not necessarily going to give you the answers to them unless you really want them. So just kind of things to think about. So the first is that, we're still making choices here. I've basically framed this whole lecture about, researchers are making choices, and that's, that's necessary. That's like nothing, we're not blaming researchers, right? We all make choices. But by doing a multiverse analysis, we can get more systematic about the choices that we make. But they are still choices. And what we've done is we've replaced choices about like a point to evaluate, that's like a data set to evaluate on, or a model to evaluate, with choices about search spaces, about the reasonable decisions you could have made. So that's a plausible critique. There's a second, which is a very related idea, which is that we also have to make choices about how to model the multiverse itself. So it's not just choices about the search space. It's, I said that we're going to model the relationship between researcher decisions and conclusions with a Gaussian process. Well, how are we going to set up that model? You saw between case study 1 and case study 2, we switched from a really simple GP to a multivariate model. There was a choice there. And again, we are kind of in this space where, yeah, do we need a multiverse analysis with multiverse analysis or something like that? I'm actually not advocating for that, but so, and then I think a third point is to think about, again, I said it's really important for us as researchers who are publicly funded and who like exist in the world to think about the efficiency of our research, particularly in terms of compute cost and climate impact. And I guess what you could say about this is I'm saying instead of optimizing and spending a little bit of compute budget on like finding the best result, I'm telling you, you should really systematically explore the whole universe of possible things. And we could really go on forever adding choices. So, you could say that there's an exploding compute cost with this kind of analysis. I don't think that, and I have an answer to each of these questions, but I think they're reasonable critiques. So I also wanted to present a couple of ideas for kind of extensions and future ideas. I think you're going to do a case study project, and some of these might just jump to, create some ideas or something. But a really simple idea would be something like making a multiverse bigger. So you could imagine thinking about the Adam versus SGD example. We didn't include model and data set there because the purpose of our paper is to introduce this analysis to machine learning, right? And to show a case study that's kind of simple and easy to understand. But if we really want to get to the heart of like which optimizer you should use, really we should be like synthesizing more papers, like more different competing claims, and we should be thinking about different data sets, different models, a fuller space of hyperparameters. There's a question of scale in there as well. An alternative idea could be like, maybe there are other multiverse analyses that you could run, right? And thinking back to that social psychology example, and I don't know that this is how the multiverse comes about, but I'd imagine that it's about which conclusions you don't believe. So I'm sure you read stuff in machine learning all the time and you think, there's no way that that's true. And if that's the case, maybe a multiverse analysis might be a good way for you to show or to even explore whether it's just a relic of researcher choices. Something that's really close to my own heart is thinking about a multiverse analysis on a more sort of like nitty-gritty kind of thing, like fairness. So I guess when we talk about fairness, right, maybe we're interested in making sure that systems work equally well or work fairly for different people. But fairness itself is like a socially contested concept. Like, what does it mean to be fair, and fair to who, and fair on what terms? And not only are they these kind of broad questions about fairness, but there are also a million different specific technical definitions of fairness. So something that I think would be a really interesting application of the multiverse would be thinking about, something like taking a data set audit or a model audit, where we've shown one of those two things is unfair, and showing how actually the claims about fairness really depend on the way you think about fairness. And I mean, we know that, but showing that those technical definitions are perhaps short-sighted would be a really, really interesting thing to look at. And there's a final point here, which is really about an assumption that we've made in this multiverse so far, and that's that the variance of the variance across the space of choices is equal throughout the space, and that's probably not true. And if we were to kind of pick at that thread a bit, there are some interesting things that could come about. And if you're interested in that, I'd love to talk about it a bit more, but it's probably a bit niche for today's lecture. So just to very briefly summarize what we talked about. So for like the 10th time, I'll say that I think that we want conclusions that are robust and general and useful. And I hope you agree with me. The multiverse analysis that we've introduced today, first introduced in psychology by Cyrus Deegan and co-authors, is a framework for exploring the effect of choices on scientific conclusions. In the machine learning setting, there are some really specific challenges about the scale of the search space. So we tried to make that tractable using a GP surrogate. And then in order to determine, to spend our budget most efficiently, we figured out that what we want to do is we want to use Bayesian experimental design to explore the space as efficiently as possible. Then we talked about two different case studies. We drew conclusions about the best optimizer, and we found actually that they're sensitive to learning rate. So that should be kind of something interesting to think about to begin with. And then in our second case study, we found, in contrast to previous work, there isn't necessarily a generalization gap if batch size is scaled with learning rate. So with that, just thanks to my co-authors, Onno, Jesse, and Neil. And yeah, thanks for listening, and I'm really, really happy to take questions.
So I'm aware it's just hit 12:55, and I think we have another lecture coming.
Oh, right.
So should we do what would you be willing to stand outside in the sort of field questions outside so we can clear out for them to come in? You're brilliant. Just thank Sam for a really great.